Okay, so in the first video we had a look at the meaning of government failure. In this second video, let's spend a few minutes thinking about the arguments in favour of for a tax on junk food. Well, lots of debate about this at the moment. A report in July of 2019 from ITV here saying that Public Health Wales had come out in favour of an increased tax on unhealthy foods as a way of reducing death and some diseases, including type 2 diabetes and obesity. The Australian Medical Association wants a tax on sugary drinks and ban on junk food ads, again as part of their attempt to change consumer behaviour. So this is highly topical. Which countries have introduced a junk food tax in recent years? I think the couple of examples you could look at. Several American states, of course, have brought in things like soda taxes, and the UK brought in the sugar drinks levy in 2018. I think the best example probably to look at in your research, and well worth having an internet search on this, is Mexico. They brought in a tax, I think, in 2013, and they've really gone pretty heavy on trying to reduce what is an epidemic of consumption of Coca-Cola and other high carbonated drinks. So I would go for Mexico as my case study in my exam if I had an essay on this. So what are some of the arguments in favour of a junk food tax? Well, here are 5 key points. The first is that a tax raises prices, and if prices go up, then that incentivises consumers to reduce their demand, to reduce their spending on high fat, high salt, high sugar foods, which ultimately then reduces the impact on our country's health system. And those impacts can be very significant if you look at the evidence. Secondly, a tax is justified if you feel that there is one or more market failures, perhaps information failures in the sector, and in particular if you think about the negative externalities of high levels of high fat, high salt food consumption. And we'll take you through the analysis diagram about that in a second. But if you put a tax on a product, you're pricing it closer to the social marginal cost of consumption. Tax revenues, of course, can be generated from a levy, and they can be hypothecated or used to fund things like public health programs or early years education or sports facilities. And there's also often an educational component to launching a new tax. People become a little bit better informed about the reason or the rationale behind a tax, and that itself can have an impact on people's behaviour. Crucially, this is a really good evaluation point in support of a junk food tax. Oftentimes in countries where such taxes have been brought in, we see manufacturers, for example, of high sugar drinks, to reformulate their ingredients, to change the product a little bit, to bring down the sugar, the salt or the fat content, in part to perhaps avoid the tax. Well, it's really important in a question such as this to use an analysis diagram. Let's look first of all at the market failure analysis. Here's the private marginal benefit of consumption, downward sloping, and the internal private cost of consumption for the consumer. And the absence of externalities, rational consumers will consume quantity Q1, where the marginal private benefit and marginal private cost are equal. Now, of course, if there are external costs of high fat foods, then the marginal social cost will lie above the marginal private cost. And I've drawn MSC as diverging away as consumption increases, suggesting that the external cost gets bigger as the quantity consumed goes up. If we were to take the externalities into account, the social optimum level of consumption would be lower. In other words, we'd like consumers from a social perspective to consume less in the way of high fat foods and things, high salt foods. That's where the social optimum is. Of course, the key is how you get there. Well, a tax on the producer, if passed on to the consumer, would raise the marginal cost of supply. That's shown by the green line there. If you increase the private cost plus the tax, in theory, if you get the tax right, that reduces consumption to Q2 from Q1. Another way of showing it, if you can use market failure diagrams, you can use supply and demand analysis quite easily. So here's a supply and demand for, let's say, a high sugar or high salt food. Current market price equilibrium is P1. If we put a tax on the product, I'm assuming here a specific tax per unit, supply curve shifts inwards, and the tax is the vertical distance between the two supply curves. That drives up the market price to P2, the quantity drops to Q2, and in theory this helps bring down the level of consumption towards a social optimum level. The advantage, of course, of a tax, and shown by this diagram, is you can show the tax revenue. The tax is the vertical distance between the two supply curves. So if we bring that tax line down, that's the tax. The tax is P2, P3, and we can therefore shade in the tax revenue to the government. So those are some of the arguments for a tax. I strongly recommend, if you get a chance, to have a look at the El Susto movie. This was it's been highly lauded. Came out in 2019, 2020, and it tells the story of how public health activists in Mexico really stirred the powerful beverage industry when they took action, direct action, to curb sugary drink consumption. Type in El Susto, diabetes, Mexico in a search engine, and you may well find the trailer to a very powerful movie. Okay, so those were some of the arguments for a tax on junk food. In our third video of 3, we'll think about government failure and some of the potential drawbacks from this type of intervention.